You are now entering the James Bond podcast. Please activate now.
Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. Welcome to the James Bond Geek Podcast. My name is Henry. How'd you do? I'm the host of this podcast, and whether you're listening on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or even YouTube, welcome to the show. And today's story, as you've probably seen in the title, is about why has the James Bond series never really done Part 1 and Part 2 stories. Now, the reason I was thinking about this, honestly, was because very recently I finished with my other half a bit of a Harry Potter marathon. I'm a big fan of Harry Potter, I don't deny it as well. And obviously we finished watching Deathly Hallows Part 1 and Part 2. And I was thinking to myself, still to this day, when we had other films do the sort of, if you will, Part 1, Part 2, Deathly Hallows actually really did work as a Part 1 and Part 2, in my opinion. And of course, we've often had afterwards like Mockingjay Part 1 and 2, and most recently Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning was meant to be Part 1 and Part 2. And it just made me thinking, actually, James Bond has never really adapted or used this potential format. And I was just wondering why. Unlike, so we say, Marvel or Harry Potter, again, as I mentioned, it's never embraced the two-part format. And could it work with 007? Now, let's be fair here. Bond films traditionally flow in a self-contained story. Okay, even the novels are very much, if you will, self-contained. They became more sort of follow on one after each other, I think, later on in the franchise. And we all know the format of the James Bond story, and it is great, and I love it to bits. But the thing is, what I'm just really thinking about here is, could this be an interesting way of potentially, if you will, shaking up the franchise a little bit and doing something a bit interesting and a bit different and new with it? And would we as Bond fans be potentially open to it? I really don't know, and that's really what's exciting me about this conversation, this process, because I think there's merits on both sides. I just don't know which way would be the best way to go forward, or really I'm just thinking about potentially ways of how it could be done. Now, obviously, within the actual film franchise itself, we have had, obviously, some sort of quasi-sequels and one official sequel. Obviously, I'm talking about On Her Majesty's Secret Service, leading into Diamonds Are Forever, which clearly follows on afterwards, well, the first bit to a degree. But again, they didn't really commit to the Part 2 story, and I still think to this day, it was a missed opportunity to really have Diamonds Are Forever, a perfect title to follow, by the way, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, to really actually go in and do a hardcore sequel and a revenge story, if you will, the License to Kill story after On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And of course, we have actually had the official sequel to a previous Bond film, Casino Royale, into Quantum of Solace, which is basically repeating everything that was done in Casino Royale to a degree, just not as good. But again, that's just my opinion. I know people disagree. All good and all fair. But we haven't really had a definitive, this is part 1 of a story, this is part 2. I don't think there's really ever been like that. And, in the books even, there was sequels. I mean, we all know about the Blofeld trilogy with Thunderball, On His Majesty's Secret Service, and You Only Live Twice. I mean, heck, that's like a part 1, a part 2, and a part 3, so to speak. So there is a bit of a precedent in the Bond history and the Bond canon, if you will, certainly with the novels, of doing something like that. And really potentially could actually we go further and do this and explore it a bit further, especially now that Bond is under new management, so to speak. Could this be a potential thing that they go and do in the future? And could this be potentially something that we see in the future? Now, just to go now, if you will, on the side of why Bond should stay standalone, here's why, in my opinion, Bond has stayed away from multi-part arcs. As I mentioned, just, first thing and foremost, it is tradition. Bond films are designed to be standalone enjoyment. Viewers shouldn't need homework, and that's something I do firmly agree with about the franchise. I think one of the great things about Bond, the reasons why it's lasted 60 plus years, is overall each story is self-contained. You can just go into it not knowing the history of the previous ones and go into it. And that's something I think that is really important to the franchise. And for me, it's the big caveat to why this idea, if you were to say why it shouldn't work, this is, I think, to me, the big reason. I don't want people to think, I've got to watch this previous Bond film to know what happened in this one. You shouldn't have that. Now, the other thing as well, is why I stayed away from it, is basically, obviously, the changing of actor over the years. Because, with Bond changing every few years, or, should we just say roughly every decade, long story arcs could be risky. Because imagine a part 1 with Brosnan. Let's say, example here, that Die Another Day was like a part 1 story, and then part 2 was starting with Daniel Craig in the role. That would be quite confusing, and it would almost like ruin, I think, the part 1 and part 2 side of it. So again, that's just another reason. I mean, the other one I think is also a bit of an issue, and again, I don't know if this will be an issue in the future, because again, we all don't know. We don't really know what's happening now with, Amy Pascal and David Heyman, but you can't deny there is larger production gaps between Bond films now, often having, 5 years between Spectre and No Time to Die. The typical 1 to 2 years between Bond films is certainly a thing of the past at the moment, and if you were going to do a part 1 and part 2 story, this couldn't be something you just decide at the beginning and then quickly try and get another one out, or if you will, part 2 in a couple of years. This would be something you'd have to really plan out, acknowledge that from the right go, you're going to do a part 1 and part 2, and then plan it out and almost like film them back to back, so to speak. So again, there's a lot of headache and a lot of head work, and it can be done. It could be done really well. So you never know, it could be something that comes up. So the last section on why I think it couldn't work is really the global appeal. Now what I mean by that is basically following on from why I think Bond films work so well is them being standalone. You don't need to do homework with them. It is easier to sell a standalone, if you will, spy thriller film just worldwide to alternate markets, especially where you don't have to worry about if they'd seen part 1 or they got part 1 previously. You just know that each Bond film is unique, it's its own story, and it works in that respect. But again, let's play, if you will, devil's advocate here, everyone, and let's just think about maybe ways, actually, how could it actually work? So again, playing this side, just hear me out on here. Let's just imagine, for the sake of the conversation here, let's say we're watching a Bond film. Part 1 ends with Bond failing a mission, an MI6 compromised and a major character lost. Or maybe Bond picks up with Bond off-grid, returning for revenge, redemption, or reinvention. Think basically Infinity War and Endgame, but shaken, not stirred. I mean, that's what I'm really thinking about here. Let's just say, for instance, we were watching a James Bond film where the bad guy plot, let's just say, sort of has begun. It started working, Bond's too late to stop it, and then part 2 is dealing with the aftermath of that. Or maybe even, let's just take No Time to Die here for a second. Let's say No Time to Die was part 1 and the next Bond film was called like No Time to Live, where actually the cliffhanger is we think that Bond's dead, but the next film you find out he actually is alive and he's still going out to, shall we say, destroy Project Heracles that isn't truly been destroyed yet. That's just sort of what I'm thinking here. And by the way, just on a side note here, how many of us would have been over the moon knowing that No Time to Die was a part 1 where the cliffhanger was Bond dying at the end, only to find out he actually didn't die at the end in the next film, which might have been No Time to Live. I can imagine so many people out there would get so much more excited about that prospect and really get excited about that. I think as well, it really could enhance and deepen the emotional impact of each Bond film. And I think allowing the Bond films to have effectively cliffhangers, which I don't think it normally has really ever had before, minus again Casino Royale into Quantum of Solace, it could just allow new and different things, I think, to happen. Example being as well, again, if you look to the past, when Bond was facing like Blofeld from You Only Live Twice and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, you knew Blofeld would escape, and you knew he'd have to fight him another day. And the cliffhanger almost was sort of like, how would Blofeld escape? How would he get out of this? While Bond trying to stop his evil scheme. So it's not, again, it's something that has a precedent, I think, in the history of James Bond. It's just not something I think that's truly been overly explored. So another thing I've actually thought about, which I really just want to sort of add in here, I was thinking about, is actually the titles of these films. Now, let's be fair, a title's a title, everyone. A title doesn't make a film better, doesn't make it worse. It certainly makes a film sound cool for marketing purposes, it makes people want to go see it, because again, who doesn't want to go see The Spy Who Loved Me? Who doesn't want to go see Skyfall? Who doesn't want to go see Die Another Day? These are cool sounding titles, and let's fair be as well, Bond films generally do have some of the best amazing titles for stories out there. But again, following on from that, we've had Deathly Hallows Part 1 and 2, we've had Matrix Reloaded, Matrix Revolutions, we've had Mockingjay Part 1 and 2, recently Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, it was meant to be Part 1 and 2, then it got Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, and then Mission Impossible The Final Reckoning. How would the titles of these ARC films be? Would they have their own individual names, or would they be known as, I don't know, let's just say Skyfall Part 1, Skyfall Part 2, and Skyfall Part 3? Again, it's just a different alternative way to looking at it, and it could be of interest and possibility. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you, if they were called Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, that'll be very interesting for the title song. Let the sky fall. Then next one, let the sky fall, Part 2. And then let the sky fall, Part 3. You know what? Thinking about it, they would have to be their own individual films in some capacity to have their own official title songs. But again, that's another thing. Would all these films within this set trilogy have the same theme going through them all? It's just possibilities and ideas that are running through my head. I personally am, you can tell on the idea of each film has its own unique individual name. Heck, again, in the Blofeld trilogy, they all have their individual names. So that's another thing to consider when looking at these multi-film cliffhangers. So now, just looking at that, we've talked about, I think, in my opinion, the pros and cons of how it could look, the advantages, disadvantages. But let's just now discuss, could it actually happen in the future? Because as we know, we await the next Bond reboot with Denis Villeneuve being the director. He's said that he's trying to make a film that will open up ready for more future missions in the future today. The timing could, I think, be actually quite perfect. Audiences today are used to like arcs, crossovers, and cliffhangers. It's now ingrained in us. It's not something like something new. It's something like we are very much used to, and we sort of do enjoy to a degree. But if the producers, Amy Pascal and David Heyman, are looking to truly reinvent Bond again, especially for a younger, should we say more Netflixly binge-ready generation, as well as us old classic die-hard fans, could this two-part epic be something that is actually really interesting? Another thing I wanted to bring up here was actually, even though I know Denis Villeneuve, going back to him, he's recently obviously directed Dune Part 1, Part 2, he's about to direct, or he is starting to direct at the time of this recording, Dune Part 3. So he's used to actually making films with cliffhanger endings, though they do feel complete whole stories in their own right. I just can't help but wonder, actually, with him taking over the role, could this be something that we do get in the future and could be of potential interest to him and basically Amazon to do? Really make some sort of big two-part James Bond epic, or heck, even if you will, a trilogy of James Bond films, each one leading into the next one to complete this like big, if you will, Blofeld trilogy, Spectre trilogy, or something like that. And again, it's new, it's different, and it could be something quite interesting, I think, potentially for the Bond franchise. But again, it does rely on people making sure they've seen Part 1, Part 2 before they even see Part 3, or heck, even seen Part 2, you need to have seen Part 1. So that is a bit of a problem, I think, with it. I also mentioned earlier, I really want to just come back to this idea, as I say, one of the big issues we've had with Bond films of recent age, and we all can admit this, we all know this, is they're basically just taking longer and longer to make. Now, I personally think now with Amazon in charge of the Bond franchise, that's going to be hopefully a thing of the past. I think once Denis Villeneuve's got Bond 26 up and running, I think Bond films will come out every 2 or 3 years regularly. I do believe that, and I think there's a possibility of doing that without a shadow of a doubt. And I think you can tell in my excitement in my voice how excited I am that Denis Villeneuve is directing Bond 26. So could it be now maybe more with this problem potentially eliminated of these longer times between Bond films? Do we get films that are coming out every 2 years, 3 years, when we can do Part 1 and Part 2 stories, design them from the get-go to have it? And then heck, going further from that, let me just, again, pitch this idea to you. Let's just use the actor I really want to play James Bond. I know he's not going to play James Bond, but just hear me out. Let's say Henry Cavill was cast as James Bond, and you knew going into it, they're going to create this 3-part James Bond epic story, which he's just going to do this 3-part story, and that's it. He's done. And the film's going to come out every year, a bit like, the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Hobbit trilogy. Going to film it all in one big go over a year. Cavill's going to be Bond for these 3 films, and that's it. But when you think about it, what an amazing potential that could be, and I think it would solidify that era as like that is known as that trilogy with Henry Cavill, the same way we know as the the Daniel Craig era was its standalone adventure thing. Again, I'm just thinking about this right on the spot here, and I think that could be quite interesting there. But it is a gamble. I don't deny. If I was in charge of 007, if I was Amy Pascal or David Heyman, I'd say, look, I'm going to be honest with you, I like the idea of potentially doing these 2-parter movies. I think it's something we could look for maybe in the future. But right now, I would stick to standalone stories. And the reason I do, for me, is I think that's the true reason Bond has survived and thrived throughout all the books, throughout the movies, games, whatever. It's thrived because each story is standalone. Yes, there's some references to the past here and there, but it doesn't take away or isn't really part of the main story. The Daniel Craig arc is, if you will, an example of the sort of overaching story arc of Bond. And I would wait to say, even though, again, Daniel Craig's not my favourite, it has technically worked. It has. But overall, I think we need to go back to some more standalone, epic, sort of one-off missions for a Bond film, and maybe look at this potentially for the future of the franchise. Again, you might think differently to me. You might agree with me. Heck, again, I'm just going to put this out here now. Imagine we had a, if you will, a story arc, a cliffhanger of maybe 2 films set back in the 1960s. Like, I've, again, really wanted Bond to go back to the 1960s. I don't know. These possibilities are all here. But I really want to know, everyone, what are your thoughts about this? Do you like this idea? Do you not like this idea? What do you think of Bond dabbling into sort of cliffhanger endings, part 1s, part 2s, heck, even part 3 stories? I want to know. Please tell me your thoughts in the comments down below. Please do like and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us. We're really trying to build the podcast here on all channels. And if you can help us here, I would be extremely grateful to all you Bond fans, because let's face it, you are all amazing. And I love being part of the James Bond fandom. I really do. So everyone, thank you very much for listening. Do look forward to the next episode. Take care. Bye.